Ok, so, bienvenidos. Lo primero es deciros que el resto de la sesión hoy será en inglés y voy a empezar a hablar inglés a partir de ahora porque nuestros invitados hoy es lo que hablan. So, thank you for being here, the three of you, and sharing some moments with us Spain. I'd like just to give you the names to the audience, but then I'd like ask you to introduce a little bit yourselves, and then we can start. So, starting with ladies first, Elise Gerich,
Right.
President of IANA.
Of PTI.
Sorry.
So my name is Elise Gerich. Thank you for the introduction. I started networking many decades ago at Merit. I don't know if you've heard of it. It was the consortium of universities in the state of Michigan in the United States, and we built the National Science Foundation network that was then converted to become the commercial internet. And I left Merit and went to a startup called At Home, which built a backbone for the cable companies in the U.S., at which point AT&T bought them out. And so I went to Juniper Networks, worked for a router vendor, mostly on MPLS protocols and things of that nature, VPLS and GMPLS and BGP stuff. And I left Juniper to come to ICANN, and at ICANN I've led the IANA services team. And as Zhao just said, on September 30th, the Department of Commerce decided to let the contract that they had with ICANN expire so that the IANA services are no longer under the umbrella of the United States government. And a new affiliate was created called PTI. It stands for Public Technical Identifiers. And that's the operational arm of ICANN for doing the IANA services. And Daniel's making faces at me. But it was a pleasure to be invited here to join my esteemed colleagues, whom I've known for decades.
Okay. Geoff Huston?
Oh, yes, my name's Geoff Huston. I started off in a very similar environment to this. I set up the Australian Academic and Research Network starting in 1989. And so there was myself and one other that ran around like crazy for the following 3 years building all that across Australia. And that lasted for almost until 1995. We just grew and grew and grew, as everyone did in this kind of environment. And then the universities, the joint universities Australia decided to sell the network to the Australian telco, and so it got taken over by a company called Telstra, and I then worked inside that company for the next 10 years, where we successfully managed to sort of take the internet and make it into a retail product in Australia. And so I was their chief architect in designing basically the internet backbone and the internet service for the country. Did that for another 10 years, and then just 11 years ago now, I stopped doing that and came to work for the Asia Pacific Regional Internet Registry, where I'm employed as their chief scientist, where, if I could describe the job, I suppose it's just research, but it's kind of trying to understand how the policies we make about addressing and naming, really, how they affect the internet, what's the feedback loop between what we think we're doing and what's actually happening.
And Daniel Karrenberg.
Hi, I'm Daniel Karrenberg. I first got into this networking in the widest sense sometime in 1980, when I got involved with something that later turned out to be EUNet, which was a UUCP, if people know that, store and forward kind of network based on Unix software. While I still was a student actually at the University of Dortmund, and later on this became a company that was later sold and bought and merged and whatever. But by that time I had left actually for the Netherlands for Amsterdam, because in Amsterdam there was the European Central Hub for EUNet, and they were desperately looking for someone to help improve the team there. And we started something that was called Inter-EUNet, which in the end actually provided IP services, and in many countries that was actually the first kind of commercial IP service, very much targeted towards research institutions, both private and public. And in the end of the 80s, these developments were all over Europe. There were internet IP, TCP IP networks springing up all over the place. And a few of us got together and said, hey, we need to coordinate this a little in the technical sense with addressing and exchange experiences so that people don't have to reinvent the wheel everywhere. So we got together and founded something called RIPE. There was 14 of us actually at the first formal meeting. And I was active in that, and then over the next couple of years, kind of the first inklings of the internet bubble happened, and RIPE grew much faster than we thought. So we needed a secretariat, and decided to write a specification for the secretariat, which I did together with Rüdiger Volk, Yves de Villers, and some other people. And 2 years later, we finally got the funding and the organization sorted out, actually inside RARE, which was then the predecessor of Terena. And I found myself in the job of being a CEO of this RIPE NCC thing, which it was called. And then after I'd accepted, I reread the specification, if you wish, the business plan or whatever it was, activity plan I think it was called, and said, gee, never write something like this considering somebody else has to do it, right? So then I did that for a while until was CEO of that, built it up. The idea was to do it for only 1 year and then give it to someone else. But then the real bubble happened, and so and when we resurfaced, like at the end of the 90s. There was like 50 or 60 people working there. It was strange. So in 2000, I decided, this is not for me. I'm not somebody to run an organization. I'm somebody to create some. So I went to become chief scientist of the RIPE NCC. So we have a two-man union of our chief scientists, and that's what I'm right now. And I do much what Geoff does. Is basically research and thinking about what's next.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great, thank you. I think one of the things that is very different from the place where we are now, that is different from where we could have been if the telcos had their way, is actually how it was built by the people that were involved in it, you among them. I wonder if you could kind of describe a little bit how this whole internet thing got started when there were clearly other options that were being tried to be imposed at that time that would probably have generated a completely different model to what we can enjoy today. I don't know who wants to go first.
I think if you wind back the time to like the early 80s, we were still before telecoms deregulation, so we had all these state-run monopolies in one or the other sense, and they weren't providing what at least my neck of the woods wanted, like researchers, computer scientists, and so on. It just didn't exist. So it was quite natural for the academics at least, and also for some industrial researchers to just build it. But you have to imagine what many people don't realize at this point, that it actually was illegal. I mean, not even commercially prohibited, but against the law to run telecommunication services. So what we did in the end was break the law everywhere. And when we ran networks off top of the PTT supplied stuff. As long as we're doing it as a hobby, the PTTs didn't care that much, and when they started to care, it was too late. It was already there, and it's my firm belief that the reason this succeeded is in the architecture of TCP/IP, very specifically IP, is where you can actually build networks without much coordination. When it grows, and as you say, as you saw, like it took from like 80 to 89. For people actually to say, hey, let's meet once in a while to actually smooth out the kinks. Yeah. But before that, people interconnected, without much talking to each other, or at least with only talking to each other bilaterally, and not everybody needed to talk to each other. And I think that's the main sort of technological reason that this worked. And of course, the environment. Then the telecom deregulation happened, and so on. The environment helped. But if you look sort of for the technology answer, I think it's quite clearly in the IP protocol that allowed interconnection without much coordination. And of course, the other thing is it was interesting for us as computer scientists or people using computers for research, was that it was clearly that the intelligence was at the edge of the network. So it wasn't, it was totally against the philosophy that the telcos had, where all the intelligence was in the network, and the services that you could run were defined by them. And it was the internet technology was attractive for us because the intelligence was at the edge of the network, and the services were defined at the edge of the network.
So how did it go in the Asia-Pacific region?
No, the same as everywhere else. You have to think back to what the 1970s had in computing. If you had an IBM mainframe, you ran IBM protocols, everything was made by IBM, the printers were made by IBM, the terminals were made by IBM, the remote job entry stations were made by IBM.
Even the paper.
Everything. If you kicked them out and bought something from digital, everything was made by digital. If you kicked them out and bought something from, I don't know, there were European manufacturers, weren't there? GE and so on. The one thing that changed our thinking was Ethernet. Ethernet was an open standard. And all of a sudden, when we started to put in Ethernets, and universities were one of the early ones, we started hooking different vendor machinery onto the same cable. This was amazing. One, because it worked. But two, you couldn't use an IBM, talking IBM, to speak to a VAX talking digital. You needed a third-party protocol because you needed something to glue it together. Now, the US had done something insanely weird. No, they commissioned the folk at Berkeley to write the networking stack for TCP/IP and put it in the public domain. It was free. So a whole bunch of folk were able to take that protocol and drop it onto almost every machine. So when we had this Ethernet running, although the digital machines like to speak DECnet and these machines like to speak that, at the university, when we wanted to stitch it together, it was TCP/IP because it was free and it worked. Fine. And then we started looking at other campuses, at other further away. And the issue was, well, what kind of network do we build? Now, the really early attempts at doing this, Norginet was one of the first ones, and we built the Australian one modelled after Norginet. Norginet built an Ethernet that spanned Norway. It was a layer 2 bridge. I think these days we call it software-defined networking, don't we? A layer 2 bridge, and they put all these protocols on top. But we tried that, but as soon as we started doing that, the only protocol that actually worked was IP. And I suppose the real reason behind that was the one piece of thinking that seemed bizarre at the time was that the address plan worked. And this is this other bit of inspired American brilliance that was possibly accidental, I don't know. In DECnet, everyone was Area 1, Node 1. Area 1, Node 2, Area 1, Node 3. So if Daniel and I wanted to interconnect, one of us had to renumber. And renumbering was as painful then as it was now. But if you were kind of thinking, you wrote a letter, or if you're really advanced, a fax, and sent it off to the Network Information Centre in the States, and back came a Class B. No questions asked, a /16 just appeared on a fax. And so we all had different addresses, so it was really easy to stitch stuff together. And so we kind of built it that way because it was the protocol that worked. What was the telco doing? Telco-centric, network-centric. They were trying to make it the voice telephone for computers. The protocol that they used and the model was entirely different to Ethernet. In Ethernet, you're always on. It's always there. You know, there's no switch. It's just cable. So if I want to send Daniel a packet, I put a packet on the wire. But with X25, is it to ring up Daniel virtually, establish a connection, and the whole bunch of stuff. Now, anyone who thinks you can build a wide area protocol different to a local area protocol has rocks in their head. Because you don't sort of jump into a different car to drive to a different city. It's a car, right? So protocols should just work. And what we wanted to do was make what happened on our lands happen across the country, happen across the world.
And it was easy to do.
And it was insanely easy. I just had to do my bit. Daniel did his bit. We overlaid the telephone company and just bought raw bandwidth. Legal or illegal, that's all we bought. And the salesmen were happy to sell it to us. They didn't really care where the money came from. And so for us, it was kind of painless.
Yeah, I go along with Geoff on the non-proprietary nature of TCP/IP. And I never did anything but TCP/IP. I didn't have any experience.
You weren't a DECnet weenie?
I was not a DECnet weenie. I was not an
Such
expert.
a lucky person.
I know, I didn't know there were. In fact, I visited Germany the first year on my job at Merit, and they asked me for my X25 address, and I didn't have one. I didn't have any idea what we were talking about. So I'm kind of a novice in that arena. But I think the reason we saw in the U.S. the succession, or the reason it succeeded for TCP/IP was because it wasn't proprietary. And for instance, the NSFNet backbone was built with a partnership with IBM and MCI. And IBM built what routers out of RTs, and they were huge mammoth things. They almost looked like mainframes. But
IBM.
yeah, they put the TCP/IP protocol on it so that it could speak to other equipment. It could talk to Proteons. Cisco was a fledgling company then. They had really hardly gotten started. And it could talk to the Ciscos of the world. And I think the other interesting thing that happened, at least within North America, was the push in the academia world to have regional networks that then connected to a backbone. So they didn't try to connect everybody individually to each other, or all backbones to every other backbone themselves. So there weren't direct peering relationships, say, between Barnet in California and Nearnet in Massachusetts. We built this backbone, and there was a tiered hierarchy. That there was an initial one that predated the one I worked on, which only created the regional networks, but they weren't connected. And it was the second one that I worked on where there was the hierarchy. And that meant that you had kind of local control for who was connected to your regional network. And then the backbone allowed those regional academic networks to talk to each other. And we had what was called the acceptable use policy. And I was
faces at you again.
I know, the czarina of the acceptable use policy for a while. Other people, did work on it. But National Science Foundation was very accommodating in the sense that they said, fine, we're not going to really be a policeman per se. If one of the regional networks wants to add an IP address to our routing tables on the backbone, if they just sent an email to me and said, this is part of our research activities with Ford Company, or with GM, or with IBM, or with somebody else, we'd add their IP address to the routing tables. And so, as you can imagine, it was becoming not just an academic backbone, it was becoming the national backbone for the United States. And I'll mention Steve Wolf, because I think he was brilliant in this fashion. He took a lot of arrows, I'm sure, in the U.S. politics to allow this to happen. And when he finally released the National Science Foundation Network, it really seeded MCINet, PSINet, UUNet with Rick Adams was already there. In fact, he was the one person who refused to ever sign an AUP. And he built his own parallel backbone.
That's Rick.
That's Rick.
But,
And that was actually, talking about Rick, is interesting because he's the founder of UUNet, but before he used to work at CSS, the Center for Seismic Studies,
Okay.
which is at the time was a quite well funded. I'm quite sure they're still well funded research institute in the U.S. who are interested in earthquakes, but what they're really interested in are the artificial earthquakes. Yeah. The ones caused by atomic tests of atomic weapons, which was at that time was still happening. Unfortunately, still happening these days, but that's a different subject. So Rick was at CSS, and his job was to basically get all the seismic data he could get his hands on. So he had basically carte blanche to buy international. Because this is, if you want to triangulate earthquakes, you can't do it just from the U.S. So to buy international capacity, and he built a bit of a UCP network, and actually
Seismo, which he ran.
Yeah.
Piet Bertelmann ran CWVAX.
Yeah, MCVAX.
MCVAX.
That was Pete.
And they were the two systems that held the academics' mailing systems together for most of the 1980s.
To be
Amazing.
fair, DECVAX was another one, and there was one inside AT&T, Murray Hill.
But who was running that?
It was Bell Labs, actually. And the funny thing was, of course, they were the phone companies, so they didn't have to pay any phone bill. So they were calling everybody. So this was when before IP, when it was store and forward, UCP, it went through phone modems. And
then it goes
and they were very popular. Murray Hill was very popular. MHNP1, I think it was called, because they called everybody else for free. Yeah. They even had when this is the anecdote part, right? they even had when the first speech synthesizers came up, the DEC talks. Yeah, they had one connected to a modem line, and all it did was when you called it, basically waited for like 5 seconds, and then said in a nicely American slurring voice, "This is the AT&T operator. I'll accept the charges." So you could make
this call.
You could make reverse charge calls to it. That was fun. Anyway, where were we?
Well, yeah, just getting there. I think one of the other things that is different from the internet and the system that was there before is that the telcos used to be like government organizations and mandated by the government to do something, and they would tell everyone else underneath how things were done.
I think it was indeed, as far as I saw it, a real battle of protocol, and it was actually quite a technical issue. The phone companies, I think, had quite legitimately also seen the issue of what we called vendor tyranny, and they actually called it what it was. It was an open system interconnection that the phone companies had been working on. Now, it wasn't just the phone companies, and a lot of work happened in Europe. And it was a lot of sponsorship in this part of the world to try and create something that it didn't matter what machine you bought, it just talked. But the problem was that they went down a path of more and more meetings, and they really had no way of reaching conclusions. And this was this whole issue of how you work. And the ethos at the time, which was then a body called the CCITT, was that disagreement meant that if you took two things that were different, you just put it in the one document.
Even if made it an option.
Yes, made it an option. Now, one of the really big arguments at the time was connection-oriented versus connectionless networking. We were, I suppose, on one side looking at Ethernet. And Ethernet was, you just put a packet on the wire. You simply just put a packet on the wire. You hope someone was listening, but that wasn't Ethernet's problem. And so in the local area, connectionless networking was brilliant. And there was a way of doing that, we thought, to take packet networking and make it work connectionless. But the phone companies switched time. That's really important. They switched time. Now, the way you switch time is you establish a link, a time division, all the way through the network. So every time you want to talk, you switch time. The computers are now dumb. They just send a bit stream. The network preserves the bit stream. So if you think computers are dumb, time switching is really good. And so OSI got hung up in what to do, and they came up with two options which are mutually incompatible, connection-oriented and connectionless. You could never make it work. And and then the fight happened right at the end of the 80s because the UK academic network had tried to build a thing called Colour Book Protocols, and they were trying to force it on the rest of the world. And over in America, you could get TCP/IP on anything for free. Didn't pay anyone, no problem, just for free.
The other thing that was great was not that it was just for free, but it was also a Unix implementation.
Yes,
and Unix became really popular at the same time, for the same reason. It ran on anything, more or less. You could. I once took a summer job to make Unix run on 3 different architectures. I mean, and as a undergraduate student, it was that easy. Yeah. And that is again also. If you do a technology history, it's sometimes it's just the matching of the right components to being available at the right time. So it was free. B, it was for Unix, and it was for a very popular brand of Unix, which was Berkeley Unix, because that ran on the VAXes that everybody loved, and that was also ported then to the other architectures of these new 16-bit microprocessors that came out, like the 8086, 68000, that kind of stuff, and so basically, any pragmatist who wanted something working, had no choice. And actually, there was a European. The other flaw. I mean, if you look at flaws, right? Why this happened is the OSI CLNP was actually quite equivalent to TCP/IP in terms of architecture, and actually the European Commission funded a project to actually implement it under BSD Unix, which was you could call it emulating, but yeah, and it was the ROSE project because the guys wanted to call it Eros and they didn't get away with it. Something OSI blah, but they made the policy problem they had with it is they did it, of course, with industry, and in the end they couldn't convince industry to release it into the public domain. So if you play what if games in history, right? If that thing would have been run by enlightened bureaucrats like Steve Wolf,
or had IBM and MCI who had enlightened pockets
in them,
allowed them to
but
to
it was basically I won't name the culprits, but major European computer vendors, basically they couldn't get them to release the stuff, and sometimes these junctures are important.
Yeah, they just change, take a road, you go down a road and stuff the other one.
Yeah.
Okay. So how much of how this thing was born do you think generated the community as we know now? Because as I was trying to say, before things were kind of very structured and very rigid and very regulated, and your approach was, well, we want things to run, so we'll do whatever it takes to run. And I think that has changed the mentality to this day of how the internet has developed, how businesses have developed on top of the internet, how the internet has so little regulation compared to telcos, for instance, even these days. If you compare how you run data over 3G and you compare how you get to run 3G as the infrastructure, it's completely different, right?
I think it was a generational attitude. Daniel said it, and it's true. He put Unix on 3 machines. It wasn't a package, didn't have a shiny plastic cover. You were meant to understand code, and you were meant to change things, because that's what having the code was all about. And so it was quite normal to see the technology as a malleable thing that you worked with and traded. And the other thing, actually, is the legacy of digital and DECAs, was that stuff was open. Anyone who tried to own stuff, including the EU, was kind of didn't want to go there. We had had enough, and part of it was Unix was just so liberating. Here was an operating system that no one owned, came with source code you could play with. You could crash it, you could do what you want, No, honestly, it wasn't, I can't touch it, it's too complicated. And we were
there
taught,
was the Gate-T consortium too, because you could build your own routing protocols.
Right, we were taught how it worked. And so the attitude was, not only did you know how it worked, you knew how to change it. That was what worked for me.
Yeah. Although formally, AT&T owned it. So whatever what came out of because they developed it, but they gave you the source code. So but at that point
all bets were off.
All bets were
Yeah.
off. Right?
Yeah.
Well, and for routing protocols, like I said, Gate D, almost every major routing vendor that became a routing vendor
Ran Gate D. Yeah.
ran
And
Gate D as their
that
base.
came out of
and
CSRG Berkeley, right?
no, it came out of Cornell.
Yeah, right.
Cornell
You're right.
University
Cornell University.
started Gate D. No,
Wasn't
Geoff.
it?
It's Geoff.
Yeah.
And I'll get his last name later. But
Geoff.
and then it went to Merit because
I know
Cornell,
it went to Merit.
Yes, because Cornell decided they didn't want to invest any more time and people.
But I think
in
it was this issue
developing
that technology wasn't a delivered package artifact. Technology was something that you took and built on and you shared. And I don't know what we're teaching now, but this is so much the way we built the internet as well. You know, you take, you build, you share.
Yeah. And it's kind of open source, the whole source code availability kind of thing. And I think if you look on one of the other things that came was not just that Unix was portable, but before that was that C was portable, the language. Was an essential ingredient here. Yeah. So this portability, this whole portability idea, was totally strange to people certainly in the beginning of the 70s. So very important.
But I think not even just the technology, but the personal relationships, because it was a very small community, and there was a community in Japan that we all interacted with, Australia, Europe, England, not so much Latin America at the time.
At the time, but
At the time that happened, but for instance, I got a call once at Merit from Milo at NASA Network, and he said someone was hacking his network. And he wanted me to shut them down to take
Milo.
to take their
would be
IP
my
address
attitude,
out of the routing protocol. But people talked like that. You knew each other, and so you developed these long relationships that led to when RIPE grew and continued to grow, when the Australian network AARNet and that area grew and became APNIC, your Australian network didn't, but APNIC evolved. So there were just a small set of people that had been working together, either implementing things or creating new things, but on this networking aspect. And so we talked a lot. And we knew each other.
Not within national boundaries too.
That's true.
Yeah. And there somehow there's a circular relationship because we also use the technology for the coherence.
Exactly.
Email was something really universal. Email, not only in IBM stacks and that kind of stuff, was quite instrumental in that. If you only look at the time zone differences and stuff, if you that technology helped also reinforce this.
Yeah. Okay. So that got us here. Do you think that this will remain so, or do you think that now that the internet is a big thing and everything is depending on the internet and so on, will we slowly but surely become like the people that you're trying to replace?
Become ossified?
Sort of, yeah.
Well, we just came back from the RIPE meeting and we had an argument, right? Yeah. And we didn't have a technical argument. We had an argument about procedures to elect officers.
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
So there's your answer.
Okay.
There was a lot of excitement. No, there was a lot of excitement when we started rolling out national railway networks. And in fact, the implications of doing that were astounding. We invented synchronous time to make the railways not crash into each other. A whole bunch of things that you wouldn't think were important came out of that work, and I think the railway system at the time rebuilt nations. Equally, electricity. At the time, it was a very detailed issue. Was it alternating current? Was it direct current? Was it Edison? Was it Tesla? All this stuff. It was a big debate. These days, it's a hole in the wall.
Yeah.
Certainly where we have now, there's not a sense of keeping... It's very hard to teach people about the underlyings of the internet anymore. They just accept it rather than try and understand it.
Yeah.
And I suspect we're bolting the covers on. And a bit like trains, it's kind of, that works. We don't need to teach those basics again. Now, when you do a process of change, it either becomes as a pent-up change that then extracts a revolutionary price because you've got to blow things away. And there's no doubt the phone companies created their destruction. They literally sat on this technology for 20 years. So by the time our generation came through, it was sort of, we see no future in the telephone company. We didn't have jobs in it. They didn't let us in. And so inevitably you had to just blast it through with what you thought was right and carry folk along. I think we're building an internet that's looking a lot like that, you know, and whoever and whatever takes its place will actually blow the incumbents out, because we're kind of sitting in that space, but we're not moving.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to be quite as pessimistic, and I don't think we're the buggy whips of the transportation industry. But for instance, today at the Right meeting, I thought there was a very interesting presentation by a guy from Facebook. And he talked about how they do load balancing and, trying to make sure that they provide service within a certain amount of microseconds or whatever. But he also said one of the things they found is that it's okay to fail, that you try things and you keep iterating on it. Mm-hmm. And so it may not be that there's going to be the ossification that we think of, because there are new companies and people out there that are trying to provide a service, and they're marrying different approaches on top of what already exists, and so they'll be compatible as opposed to replacing them. So it may not be a replacement, it may just be an evolution or an iteration. So I'm not quite as pessimistic, because I think there are companies out there that are still coming up with new ideas to figure out how to provide services on top of the infrastructure, where they can use the existing infrastructure to provide new services and better services.
Actually,
you didn't take that away from that?
I think there's a very different thing going on, and in some ways you need to understand the difference between the internet and telephony. Mm-hmm. The social contract that the telephone companies made with their respective governments was actually quite an interesting contract. Universal service, universal pricing. You don't pay more when more people are trying to use the phone network. They don't do charge rate pricing like they do on airlines. Everyone got a phone, everyone paid the same, and if your phone didn't work, no matter where you were in this country or in my country, someone came out and fixed it. That was the social contract. In some ways it was expensive because we were paying for it. The internet never has a social contract. No one's blessed to run internet. It's open business. It's private business. It's private sector. And part of it is, it solves the problems that makes money. That's not necessarily the problems you want solved. And that's, I think, right now, the crux of the debate. Yeah. Because the money is building a new television feeder network. The money is building Netflix. And that's fine money, and there's a lot of it. Is that what you want? Is that what my country wants? Is that what people want? Now, people love entertainment, and that's great, but how do I send Daniel an email message if I can't do it unless I use a Netflix mailbox? You know, where do we go from here and why? And I think we're now sophisticated enough to have this next debate about what's the social contract behind public networking. Is chasing money enough? Will that solve all of our problems? Or do we actually need to understand what we replaced, telephony, and what we need to do to replace, to build that degree of universality and access? And it's hard to have that conversation, but I suspect it's a necessary one. And I actually thought ISOC was the place that was meant to do this. Humbly. I thought it was your job, not my job, right?
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, what you're seeing now is like the networks really doesn't matter anymore, and the telcos are pretty mad about that when they complain about Googles and so on. But at the same time, they might have a portion of reason in the sense that we seem to be creating networks that are just feeders into big aggregators. So the internet kind of disintermediated the communication between parties before, and now we are going back somewhat to either you are in Facebook to do these sort of things, talking to Google to these other sort of things, talking to Netflix to watch TV, like these huge attraction centers that seem to be where all the network traffic goes to.
Now the one exception is this network, Red S. In my country it's the Academic and Research Network. There's no Facebook there. Right? They don't operate that way. And it's kind of these two models that once again are almost in conflict. Of one, an academic and research network that has an entirely different service ethos to Telefonica's internet. They're solving different problems again. And it wouldn't surprise me if the technical evolutions differ, and at some point again you're going to have what do we want? And I'm all for it in some ways, that I think it's a constructive difference and a constructive debate.
Okay. Anyone else?
I was going to say that I actually see the University of Michigan Academic Network. I'm not there, but I'm alumni.
Oh.
So alumni, I guess. I get their information, and it's very much more like getting a Facebook page or a social networking page now. And I get little videos and I get links to like things, and so I'm thinking, so they're adopting kind of what the youth is bringing to the university, and they're evolving the normal email communications. That doesn't happen that way anymore so much, and people don't know the domain names. They just have search engines, and there's you talk to somebody about the domain name and they don't, what is that? Do I go to Google and what does it tell me? So I think that the adoption within the university community is mirroring something that happens in the commercial community, but they're not making money out of it.
So we are now 45 minutes into this chat. Does anyone else have questions?
There's nothing in the chat.
Also from the remote side, of course.
But I think the money's in the applications now, or it's not in the infrastructure. They're just a commodity.
Well, commercially, as I said, and there is this commercial area, and there always has been, of making money. But it was always said in Australia, the telephone company would have only had 300 customers if all they wanted to do was make money. And I think even in Spain, you would set up the telephone company in Madrid and everyone else doesn't matter, because it's a loss. And when you look at this, it's kind of, how do you achieve an ethos of public communications? Because I must admit, I think we've come a huge way in computational capability, what computers can do and what comms can do. And if we're just going to use it to feed Netflix, that's a pretty sad answer. I can watch movies. Well, you always could. That's not that interesting, is it? And it's kind of, how do you push this further? What can we do? And I always thought the academic sector was kind of the hope that there's imagination, there's creativity, and you don't have to make money this year. You can wait, you can explore, there's no risk, or at least there's no IPO luring around that I'm going to make lots of money, so therefore the product needs to be on sale tomorrow.
Yeah, well, I don't know universities in other parts of the world, but in the U.S. at least, there are universities that have adopted Stanford's model, which is they allow professors and bright students to take a sabbatical for a year and start a company. And all Stanford asks for are the stock options. And Stanford's gotten really rich this way. And so other universities are following that same model.
I do not think open flow was a net positive.
Oh, but there's...
Details. The model was right, the outcome was wrong.
Well, but they allow enough of these to be seeded that, it's just like any startup. You have maybe 10%, I don't even think 10% succeed of startups.
True.
And so anything that the university allows to go off and try and create a small little business at which the university benefits somewhat, and the professor comes back and somebody goes off and runs a company, is an interesting commercial thing that the universities in the U.S. do.
You just started saying about the social contract, right? At least in Europe, we started with all these monopolies, privatizing the monopolies just on the days where the new generation networks should be deployed. And that was a big problem, because that company that wasn't made for profit, because it was a national PTT, then becomes a for-profit company. And imagine that you have a very strong company in your country that with 100 euros invested in Brazil, the return of the investment is much bigger there than in Spain. what do? Invest in new networks in Brazil, not here. What happened then? The fiber, no? You have to deploy fiber. Well, deploying fiber is expensive. Right? It's not cheap. Well, now it's cheaper, but let's say 10, 15 years ago, then you have a problem. And not only in Madrid or Barcelona, where there is like in Castellana or the main roads, there is like, or in Amsterdam also, 8 pipes, different kind of pipe. But not only in all the city, I mean in the center, the city center. And what happened when you replace a copper cable and put a fiber, and then if you have a tele-assistance or an alarm or whatever, the first thing that in a fire or something, you cut the power. And if you don't have electricity, what happens with your router? Doesn't work. And then your alarm doesn't work, your tele-assistance for an elder people doesn't work. So we are thinking in that the most vulnerable people or the geographically more scattered, distributed people are not going to have fiber in the next 20 years because this, from my point of view, wrong privatization of these telcos. And then also the guys who have the fiber are that in case of something that the power in the central or the centralized power, I would say.
I used to work for a telco for 10 years, and we used to love the 50-volt DC argument. We played it all the time. You know, no matter what happens, the telephone will always work. I'm sorry, you've got batteries, you've got Wi-Fi. You know, something will always work because consumers will do something about it. And like the radio will work, you know, there's other stuff around. And one thing the telephony didn't do was choice. You know, this works independently, this mobile phone is connected via SIM to a completely different thing to anything in this room. One might go down, the other might not, and that argument. The argument that I do think is kind of a tough one is when you start doing fibre in the ground, you're burying your money for 25 years. Governments can do it because it's, you know, taxation. Cities can do it. Private companies find it hard. Now, they've got to be incented. They've got to have a break on taxation, exclusive access to the customer. Something's got to sort of change over that. High cities, high-density cities, Seoul in Korea, thousands of people per square kilometre, fibre's easy. Madrid, relatively dense, pretty easy. Los Angeles, it's like where I live in Canberra, very big, broad cities because no one lives in high-rises. Really expensive. Who pays? The telephone company goes, not touching this.
Yeah, because they're not used to that business model.
Yeah, exactly.
But for instance, I live in a place that used to be the smallest community, smallest what you call it, municipality in the country. And I have fiber to the home. Why do I have that? Because some people thought about it and said, hey, who understands the business model of a long-term investment? Sink your money for 25 years. Well, it's the real estate people.
Yes.
So they went and interested a real estate company actually a couple of them in this, and my fiber is installed and run by the real estate guys, and they understand this. They basically and they have the right network, of course, also with the banks and so on to be credible and say we have a 25 years business model.
Yes.
So this is brilliant. I mean, and they also know how to build stuff.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's not like a telco where the guys who actually and the shovel are the lowest. You know. But they are respected because, you know, whether you build under the ground or above the ground doesn't make much of a difference. You know, the only pity about this is that they sold out. The building people at some point got cold feet and sold out to the telco.
Oh.
But they're still building. So maybe the knowledge got transferred.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? But you also have to look at you know, when you go and say like very hard, the question is to find the right guys to actually do it. And I'm quite happy. I have fiber and I have cable in the home, so I have two totally independent broadbands. And just to give you a price point I have downgraded the cable because the fiber is like 40 down, 4 up, and costs me like 30 euros a month, and the fiber to the home is 500 symmetric and costs me like 500, yeah, 500. So well, they could do a gig. They could do more than a gig, but they basically, I think, and this is to explain it.
You said you were rural.
I'm smallest in the company. Well, but okay, the population density in the Netherlands is much higher than Spain.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's much more densely populated. So to give you an idea, the village was 7,000 people, 6,500 before we got annexed by the next big one. So the thing is, I buy my service from an ISP, who buys then the fiber, and I have a choice of ISPs, which is also important, and these ISPs then say, okay, we'll start them away to ask for more money in the future for an upgrade that's basically a bit,
Switch.
But so you know, if you build infrastructure, it's the other thing. If you build infrastructure, get people who are used to building infrastructure rather than running a telco. Yeah, sorry, my little soapbox.
Yeah, true. I don't think the US works like the way though.
No.
There was a couple of fiber projects in the US run by the telephone company. Verizon did a Fios project. Not all that successful.
Google ran one too.
Google ran one in Kansas City right under Sprint's nose just to prove it was possible. I think.
Well, on all the cable companies have run it, but they do it in order as renewed. So the way our cables work, a city will give you a franchise to operate the cable television system, and the cable companies went in and they promised to put fiber in different neighborhoods to win the franchise from a different cable company. And so sometimes that got built and sometimes it didn't. But
And you know, just to add a little bit more color to the real estate people, they actually got some government money for the first 2 or 3, to offset the basically the uncertainty. But after that, totally private enterprise.
Okay. Stefan? Oh. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I just have a question about this thing of, yes, we were in the United States, we invented this kind of thing, yes, and now if we don't want to care anymore about this IP assignation, IANA, and all this process where Ted Cruz and some people said, okay, the internet will be in hands of the Russians or whoever.
The Chinese and the Indians.
The Chinese and all these people, you know, and yes, I've been worrying about it, what will happen, and so it's. Please tell us a little bit about this. What will happen?
I think primarily it's
you know,
business like usual.
Yes, because it's you know, the people on the streets, they are with their mobile phones and and sometimes you think. If you think about how near you can be of not having internet anymore and your mobile phone, because some people has to talk and they don't know which will be the decisions, and I worry about this kind of things.
A lot of people did, and obviously still do. So fundamentally, the U.S. government invested 30 years ago or 40 years ago in TCP/IP.
40.
It's 40. And they got out of that business of building that. It became things that everybody else could have. It was freely available. At the same time, the U.S. government was funding parts of the administration of the protocols. And they had planned 20 years ago to get out of that business. DOD had gotten out, NSF had gotten out, Department of Commerce was kind of the stucky, I guess, for a period of time when it transitioned from those other U.S. government agencies. And the Department of Commerce said 20 years ago, we think in 2 years the U.S. government will get out of it completely. Well, that was, 20 years ago that they thought it would take 2 years. It took 20. And so the U.S. government's role has been very lightweight all along. They haven't really, well, in most cases.
I have a different view.
It has not stopped anybody from registering a protocol parameter. It has not stopped a domain name from getting in the root zone. Oops.
But
Anyway, let me finish my story, then you can rebut.
Can be fun.
Yeah, so the whole idea of the stewardship transition from NTIA to the community was that the U.S. government wouldn't put their fingers in the pie at all anymore. It was the conclusion of this 20-year evolution. And the people who do the job would still continue to do the same job. Particularly the RIRs had always taken, not always, have taken control in, I don't know how many, at least 10 years, to create global policies. And those are what get implemented by the IANA services. The IETF had always driven what protocols and their parameters got registered in their databases. And it's the names area where the U.S. government still had some oversight. And so that's the area that's now changed. But the criteria for setting that up are still set by the community. And the rules that we follow are from RFC 1591, which is in, I think, 1989 or 19-something. 19.
No, before.
It's,
No.
no, it's like around 1990.
Yeah.
so
And
everything
that-
you said is right.
Exactly.
Everything you said is right. But no, the genesis of the
He's
problem.
the half-empty guy.
The
I'm
genesis
the
of the
half-full guy.
sensitivity. The genesis of the sensitivity and the whole issue around what the US was all about actually started with AT&T and international telephone call accounting settlements. You had it here. When you called the US, it cost you $20 a minute. But when the US called you, it only cost the US folk $5 a minute. Why? Because what the phone company in Spain didn't want was to call the US, because they had to pay AT&T call termination charges. Whereas if they got the Americans calling here, AT&T paid Spain. AT&T was spending $3.6 billion a month in international. They had a building in Washington that was many stories big, and they lobbied Congress to say the ITU should stop doing call accounting settlement, unsuccessfully. And they spent over a decade trying to rip that system apart. Internet gained prominence. AT&T pressured the Clinton presidency through Vice President Gore. And
Who invented the internet.
Who invented the internet. And Ira Magaziner carried a unique policy, and his instructions were very, very clear. Keep the internet out of the hands of the ITU. And this was really about AT&T being desperately worried that the Europeans in particular would force call accounting settlements back onto the internet through an ITU managed by majority, and the US will always lose.
It votes by country and by majority.
And they will always lose.
Andorra counts the same than the US.
Right.
Yes.
So the overall rule is keep the internet out of the ITU. That was it.
Yeah.
And they
That's
spent
true. I
they spent a
didn't say that.
huge amount of residual interest in IANA and ICANN, because they thought that was the one thing when they could express that if any country tried to say, let's take it to the ITU, they would say, we're not playing this, and we're keeping the internet out, and our residual interests.
And that's why the Department of Commerce got stuck with this thing.
And,
Yes.
and the Department of State,
Commerce.
the Foreign Affairs Department, was actually an ITU fan.
Yeah.
And there was, why is Department
I
of
couldn't
Commerce
say these
a
things.
domestic department having all these international trips, going to all these international conferences? They're more important than us. This is wrong. Lots of tension. Now, things were going fine and nothing was going to change, ever. They were going to withstand the pressure. They did it wicked. They did it every single major conference until Snowden. The revolution was totally damaging. The US lost a huge amount of diplomatic capital. Yeah. They had to give in. Something had to show the rest of the world that they were actually nicer people than they looked. Truly. And part of it was, what are we going to do? What fights are worth losing? And this one was one where they actually did nothing. The US government had nothing to do with
So we
IANA
do
in practice.
agree. Okay.
They did nothing. If they gave it up, they gave up nothing, but they won diplomatic capital. And that's what you've seen playing through.
And they also lost potential diplomatic negative capital.
Exactly.
Because if they ever did anything, it could only be wrong, right?
Yeah.
Now, their view is, I think now,
Yeah.
the pragmatists in Washington, it will never go to the ITU in its current form.
No,
There's too much private industry at stake. This is not telcos and government, you know. No government would dare to speak for the private internet industry easily. They would find their own constituency going grumble, grumble. You know, it's not just Telefonica, it's Orange, it's Vodafone, it's this and that. Can't do it anymore. So I think the US kind of feel we'll pay the price, but it's okay. And I think they're now confident that whatever takes this on in intergovernmental systems will have a multi-stakeholder foundation, and it might have some way of governments expressing themselves, but governments voting in the ITU, totally unlikely in my lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
It's your lifetime it's got a problem.
And
not mine.
ICANN and PTI is still in the state of California and all that stuff. So
Yeah.
And the interesting for the historians, you know, this is all fairly nicely documented in the Magaziner era, green paper, white paper, all that stuff.
Yes.
They weren't really secretive about it. I mean, it's
No.
like and I think Geoff has the essence of the story pretty right.
Okay.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
Just among colleagues.
So does that help you? Does that allay some of your fears?
Well,
Assume it.
okay, let me add one. Thank you. Can I add 10 seconds? Because the actual infrastructure that's built is not run by ICANN, although some people in ICANN would like us to believe that. Yeah. It's just these damn identifiers. Yeah. And even if IANA, you know, no offense intended, didn't do anything for a year, the internet would be nicely running.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the other thing why the man on the street with his iPhone shouldn't be, or with his mobile phone shouldn't be worried, because ICANN does not run the internet, although some inside ICANN want to make you believe that. Yeah.
Okay. So we're running a bit late, but there are 3 questions, and have each of you address them and then summarize. So who wants to go first remotely? Malaga?
Okay, remain me. But actually, I've been enjoying all the talk, because when you started talking about StateNet and all that thing, you brought me back in time. And actually, I have really not a clear question there. How should we think roads? I think that fiber should be in the hands of those that create the roads. And then we put the traffic on top of it, and we go anywhere, as we do with our cars. So I agree with the model that you were telling about in the Netherlands, and I've known the Swedish model, that it's the municipality that runs the fiber, and then you select the provider to go out of your town. So I much agree with the idea of this being an infrastructure that should be open to anyone. But from here, actually, I don't have a real question. So thanks a lot for a wonderful, it's been absolutely great.
Euskadi?
Yasu.
Hello. I enjoyed the talk also, but I don't have any question. Thank you.
Oh, okay. I was told you had. And Mikel, Catalonia.
Well, let's try to break this stream. Okay, thank you for the talk. That has been enjoyable. The question, maybe we talk a lot about the past. Why don't we think about the future? A few days ago, we see a cyber attack against the company, a domain holder. We see a lot of services down. We can see the internet growing with the Internet of Things. Going to happen to be the same 5 years from now, just to put the date, just not to say 10 years.
Very clear. There is a question.
Yeah.
So I go back 10 years, 2006. Couldn't do video. It was all the web. Early Facebook. I'm not sure. 2000. Oh, first iPhones.
No smartphones.
These days, everything is mobile. The desktop computer's dead. You know, all that's died. So in 10 years, we've gone into our pockets.
Thank you very much.
Now, it's pretty clear the next 10 years, this is a bit weird. suspect it becomes more embedded in individual things because, you know, you can and there's a market for it. So the elements, much the same. I think it's IP. I think there's a lot of radio. There's a lot of basing going around. And there's a lot of devicing. But after that, I kind of get hazy. Because in 2003, I'd have never picked this. Ever. 3 years before it happened, whoa, that is so big. This is only 10 years old. I give up.
Yeah.
Very savvy. Very, yes.
I guess I'm with you, Geoff. I'm not very good at predicting the future.
I'd be a billionaire if I did, yeah.
It's easier to predict the past, you know. It's not
Well, it's everything changes, and just even when we started decades ago, I didn't think that the internet would be so commercially embedded in everything we do. I never dreamed on it. Someone told me, I think it was when I was leaving Merit, oh, you know, I'm going to make money on these ringtones. And I said, ringtones? You've got to be nuts. Who's going to pay for ringtones? And for a while, people did.
For a while.
And, you know, stuff like that, I'm just not very good. But other people are very creative. I'm worried about having cars the way to murder people. Because you'll be able to hack the internet and kill someone on a car. I mean,
Cyber attack.
I'm sorry. So it's not just cyber attacks I worry about.
It's a car attack.
Yeah, you know.
Yeah, so, okay, let me
I shouldn't put ideas in anyone's head.
let me be in the middle of this. You know, I'm absolutely bad at predicting commercial successes because, you know, in the microprocessor days I predicted that the 8086 was the least likely 16-bit microprocessor to ever make it. Yeah. So and I also predicted that Unix, that this whole thing that the other people in Microsoft were developing, the people across the corridor from the network group, which later became MS-DOS, was never going to be a technology. And so I think in technology we'll see much more radio, and we'll see much more tiered radio, yeah, because the frequency spectrum is limited. So and we'll see if it's all successful, see devices, and I'm with Geoff here. It's going to be you know, something in my glasses that does the phone bit and so on. That is engineered such that it's seamless. It's one service. Yeah. I think that's a very hard problem because the people who run the infrastructure have no incentive to actually block them. Yeah. And that's a real problem. And I think it's a bit of something where I would think that the public interest and those minding the public interest need to find ways to make them without destroying stuff. Yeah. But then again, you know, I'm an engineer. I'm not a politician, and I'm not a businessman.
Okay. So I wanted to wrap it up for the audience to make like an executive summary of what we have seen in this afternoon. We have had an incredible discussion about the origins we have here with us today. Probably, I would say, a part of the internet, a part of the people, because the internet is made by people and very special people, not a lot of people. I would say around 800 people, the pioneers. We have the pioneers representing the US, Australia, and Europe. So, Joao, you made a great selection for ISOC. To review that, we have heard that you guys broke the law because you couldn't make anything different. Not really the law, but at least the status quo that we
That's
had.
true.
Otherwise, 1987 in this country, you had to pay 100 pesetas, which is less than €1, but to have another telephone at home.
Yes.
Because you was so proprietary, no? And also breaking this because there was no other option. You made a lot of progress in different places. And especially here in Europe, thanks to Daniel, he said that not everybody had to reinvent the wheel. Because most of the people we had, I was also a pioneer there in Barcelona, and we had also the same problems everywhere. Where do I connect to? Why I have to pay $6? Later on, you had been talking about the future, the connections. You mentioned the real estate as a new approach on building new generation networks, and we have been also talking about the problems of replacing fiber or copper with fiber, and also the radio networks. And we just mentioned about the future, as you said, it's very difficult. Most of us would be rich because we have been in the sector for decades. If at least one of our predictions was true, right? would be really rich. And I think it has been a really interesting and amazing evening, and thanks for coming here at ISOC, which is your house, and thanks everybody for coming.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Our pleasure.
Okay.
We had some delay.
Bueno, tenemos regalos.
Oh, fine.
This is a present from our sponsor.
Is it,
Internet Society is sport.
Thank you.
It's sponsored by
Thank you.
some companies, and
Thank
we
you very much.
had it's a little detail.
Not electronic.
Not is it analog, not digital, but I hope you enjoy.